Okay, well, should we get started, do you think? All right. First I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for dialing into this webinar. Our first co-hosted by Environmental Defense and Hill Country Alliance and the Headwaters Alliance. It's a very timely subject. What's next for Texas water after obviously a very disappointing legislative session? We began very hopeful. We had a lot of very important bills that would certainly get things started in a good direction. And we developed a lot of support, but we ultimately were not very successful other than the bill that was passed for Texas Parks and Wildlife, which allows them to participate in things that they probably should have already been participating in. But those are small successes, so we can celebrate that. So I want to introduce myself first. I'm Ted Flato. I'm an architect and landowner and founding member of the Headwaters Alliance. Our alliance is focused on rivers and springs, keeping them flowing for generations, and their connection to groundwater. And that's a big part of the topic today. The Headwaters Alliance began really at the tail end of our last drought. We have a family ranch that's precious to us. It's on the headwaters of the Nueces River. And after a 5, 6, 7 year drought, our river was looking anemic, and I imagine that would be the case of many others that were in similar conditions. These marvelous rivers and springs that come out of the Edwards Plateau. And it was a natural condition. And I knew that this is a condition that could become the normal condition, even when we had great rains, if we were not to get together with fellow landowners and others to change the trajectory of the future of Texas rivers and springs. And so we brought this group together. We first reached out to the Hill Country Alliance, who does this for a living, who are advocates for landowners and landowner involvement. And so they're really basically our backup band. And then we also knew that we had to have absolutely strategic partners. And many of those are in this webinar today. But one in particular was Vanessa Flores, who's heading up the water, their water focus for environmental defense. And they've been instrumental in working with us on legislative issues most recently. So I want to do a shout out to both of those important organizations who've been wonderful partners for us. And now I'd like to introduce Vanessa Flores, a very good friend and advocate for rivers and springs, and she will introduce the webinar. So Vanessa, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted. I really appreciate it. And it's been wonderful getting to know you and working with all the landowners in the Headwaters Alliance. That's such a critical part of our work at EDF, is partnering with stakeholders like everybody on this panel to develop solutions to Texas's water challenges. So I'm going to briefly introduce everyone, and then I'll provide a little bit of background before we get into the discussion. So we are extremely grateful today to have with us Vanessa Escobar, who's the general manager of the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District, or you can say it really fast, BSEACD. Like, I've gotten really good at doing that. Robert Mace, who doesn't really need an introduction, but Executive Director and Chief Water Policy Officer for the Meadows Center at Texas State University. David Yates, the Chief Executive Officer for the Texas Wildlife Association. And David Langford, who is a private landowner with the family ranch in the Hill Country, a member of the Headwaters Alliance and former CEO of the Texas Wildlife Association. So thank you all for being part of this discussion today. As Ted mentioned, the purpose of this webinar is to talk about what's next for Texas water after the conclusion of this legislative session. Addressing the state's water supply challenges was not a priority this session, even after we had the historic winter storm that exposed vulnerabilities in our water systems. And as we all know, Texas's changing climate will also threaten the resilience of our water supplies. Dr. John Nielsen Gammon, who speaks a lot, around water conferences, our state climatologist, says that Texas is not just going to have more frequent droughts, that Texas is actually becoming more arid. So we need to think long-term about how we manage our water resources in a sustainable way to ensure their longevity and to protect the people and wildlife who depend on this water. The Water Development Board just recently issued its draft state water plan for 2022, and it estimates that Texas's population is going to increase by over 70% by 2070. That's over 20 million more people living in Texas. Where will the water come from? And how can we ensure that we don't deplete our water resources as the state grows? As welcome as the recent rains have been, we all know that there will come a time when the rain will stop. And the question is whether Texas will be prepared, whether our leaders will have done all that they can do to ensure that our groundwater supplies, the communities, the landowners, the wildlife, and the rivers and springs that depend on their flow will be resilient. I think that all of us on this webinar and most of you who have joined us today are concerned, and we should be, about whether the groundwater supplies that have sustained past generations will be able to accommodate future Texans as well. And so I'll begin by asking each of you, in light of the lack of progress this session on relatively benign issues like the development of groundwater data and science, and studies on groundwater and surface water interaction, what concerns you with respect to how we are managing groundwater resources in Texas, and what should Texans be concerned about? And I'll remind everybody to unmute. And David Yates, why don't we start with you?
Sure. First, thanks for including TWA with this discussion. I really appreciate that. Well, this session had a lot of collateral damage. We started out in essential lockdown from COVID and civil unrest, and it just the Capitol itself was a surreal place for really almost the first half of session. Then we've got the freeze, we've got a new speaker, new committee chairs and members in the House, a lot of cross-chamber tension that really overlaid the entire legislative process. And the net result was about 15% of bills that were filed actually passed, and the normal average is about 20%. So, some of the simple bills or benign bills or even things that are agreed to can still fall by the wayside, through that grinder of the Texas legislature. So I guess, first off, I want to say keep the faith that it will get better. The legislature, you think about the span and width of the subject matters that go before those members, and they're necessarily an inch deep and a mile wide on all issues, and then go deep on issues that are important to them or their constituents. So when we've got complicated stuff like groundwater policy and water regulation, there are really strong headwinds to get everybody agreed to and get something across the finish line. At the end of the day, I think the big challenge, that was a big point of departure, but what I see is the underlying challenge is just the disparate regulatory approaches, the different ownership strata of public, of private, of water rights seniorities, accumulated law that comes across in some ways as self-contradictory, at least when you apply it across the state. And it accumulates into what I like to call a pile of wire coat hangers. It is a mess. It's hard to pull apart, and navigating something that complex through the legislative process with all of those headwinds, you know, it's hard to get things across the finish line.
So Vanessa, do you agree that Texas groundwater policy is a pile of wire coat hangers? I like that analogy.
You know, I think that's a great analogy. I think it's complicated and it's complex, and it always has been. But there are many things that we've gotten right. And I do think that from the groundwater district management perspective, I think it's important that we continue to see momentum and build upon what we've gotten right. And as far as things that I'm kind of focusing on in the future, or things that concern me, I would say, you know, the next bad drought, I think, really concerns us groundwater district managers. However, we spend a lot of time kind of developing policies and strategies so that we are better prepared to handle those situations. But along those lines, you know, while we do have strategies that would involve production curtailments for our permitted users, or even just strengthening our conservation measures, I think it's also important that we emphasize and invest in the alternative supplies, because it's going to require both to conserve, but also to rely on other innovative supplies like ASR and desal and reuse. And so I hope to see more conversations focus on that in the future and investing in that. I also think one area that's of interest to me in our district are DFCs. So if people have been following the conversations in groundwater management, we do have joint planning efforts that occur at our groundwater management areas. And so we set in place policies for what we want our aquifers to look like 50 years down the road. And in fact, we're actually in a third planning round right now. But I really look forward to seeing more conversations focus on how we monitor and track progress against our DFCs. And that really includes some closer evaluations as to whether those DFCs are truly sustainable, and whether we actually have the right tools and measurements and methods to help us monitor, are we exceeding those DFCs, or will we be in the future? So along those lines, I think everyone in the groundwater district world is probably concerned about resources, having adequate resources. There's many GCDs that really have modest resources to carry out their mission and their objectives. And so I think we all know and recognize how critical of a role science plays in developing our equitable management policies. However, it's really a significant time and monetary investment. And it's not just one time, it's ongoing and recurring. So those are things I'd like to see us, you know, build some good strategies around.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. And just for those who don't know the wild world of acronyms in Texas water law and policy, DFC stands for Desired Future Condition, which is basically a long-term management goal that groundwater districts set over shared aquifers that they manage with other groundwater conservation districts. And so it's an important process to get involved in, and there are some major challenges with it because many of those desired future conditions are allowing kind of the slow drawdown of aquifers over time. And so Ted, you know, EDF's worked a lot with your members in the Headwaters Alliance we've talked a lot about these issues with drawdown. What is your thoughts on the challenges that we're facing, and kind of what's most concerning to your members in the Headwaters Alliance?
Well, it's thanks, Vanessa, and thank you again for putting all this together. This is what a great group. No, the Alliance, we're all extremely concerned that what we have and what our grandparents have had and parents have had in terms of these beautiful rivers and springs are not going to always be here for future generations. That it's a fragile system, and currently it's not protected. Certainly not the Upper Everest Plateau and all these springs of the Guadalupe and the Llano and the Colorado, and all of those sources are coming out of an area and a series of aquifers that there is no there's no real protection. There are groundwater districts, but groundwater districts don't necessarily require, I mean, they need kind of the backup, the legislature to give them enough ability to help make good decisions. And so I think what I would hope will happen here in the future is building the case that the importance, one, of rivers and springs for the future of our state. I mean, it's a big part of the livelihood of the hill country. You can't quite imagine the hill country without its rivers and springs. And so emphasizing the importance of those rivers and springs for both landowners and those who enjoy the parks and those who enjoy the camps and those who enjoy wherever opportunities for fishing happen or canoeing or any of these great things. But but that it's something that's fragile, that isn't a guarantee. There is no protection, and there's no thoughtful legislation and science that's connecting the groundwater and the surface water and having that discussion. And so I know that anyway, that is the great concern. And so this topic is huge about what's next.
Yeah. David Langford, what are your thoughts on that? I don't hear David. Well, why don't we wait for Robert Mace? Do you want to hop in and?
I think David was muted.
Oh, is he muted? Okay.
But he's no longer muted now.
Say something, Dave.
I
Yeah.
thought I was unmuted.
Okay, we can hear you. All right, go ahead.
I'll go. I'm going to sort of piggyback a little bit on what Ted just brought up. And that is, there's a lack of education. There's a lack of understanding about this. And I'll give you one example. Long ago, in the early 90s, in early Texas Wildlife Association, we started an educational foundation to sort of try to attack the lack of understanding of natural resources and those processes. The first call we got after we put out the word that we were going to start hosting field days on private ranches and public lands was from a local school district who, so we put together that field day and we took them to a private ranch and went to the Kerr Wildlife Management Area up above Hunt. At lunch, the head of the department that contacted us, I asked her, I said, why did you call us? Why did you ask us to do this? And she said, these high school children, I'll never forget this. She said, these high school children do not know what a flowing spring is. We're studying Robert Frost right now. They do not know what a flowing spring is. I will make a wager, if you stop people in downtown Austin or downtown San Antonio on a busy street corner and ask them the importance of flowing springs to rivers and groundwater in the state of Texas, they'll look at you as if you had landed from Mars. They don't have a clue what you're talking about or why it's important to them. So our challenge is one of education, because once the public becomes aware of what the issue is and understands it, their elected officials are going to follow what they're elected to do. So I think it is much more basic than we probably think it is. The lack of understanding of natural resources is absolutely astonishing in today's public. And we've got to do something about that. And Vanessa is absolutely right about groundwater management areas and the DFCs. I served 2 years on Region L's groundwater management area. And the DFCs, that process is flawed at best, because groundwater definitely is mysterious and occult. So we've got to do a better understanding of the overall problem, and we have to have a better understanding of what the groundwater resources, what they are, and what sort of use can they stand.
And Robert Mace, I mean, you're now at the Meadow Center, but prior to that, we were at the Water Development Board. Do you agree with David Langford that the DFCs are our future condition process is a big problem, or do you feel like there's other challenges that when we're trying to devise solutions we should be focusing on instead?
You know, I'm inflicted with seeing the pros and cons and everything. You know, I think the pro on the desired future condition process is that it does require districts to identify a goal. Before the desired future condition process came along, most districts did not have a management goal that they were going towards. And so I think that's a positive aspect of desired future conditions. Maybe what, and I hate to put words into David's mouth, but I think maybe what David's alluding to is that, you know, the goal setting is one thing, but the achieving the goals or the regulatory framework and the legal framework around achieving goals is difficult for groundwater conservation districts. I've been working on a study in Central Texas, kind of looking at groundwater resources and looking at groundwater permitting. And, you know, a lot of districts feel like they do not have the tools to achieve their desired future condition, that they have to keep loosening it to avoid lawsuits and to you know, allow for the increased pumping and the growth that's coming. So I guess, you know, in part, depending what David's talking about, I could agree with what he's saying, but I do think it's good to at least have a goal that the districts come together and define.
Well, and it seems like another issue is that with respect to groundwater surface water interaction, the science that districts need to be able to set desired future conditions, to set goals that will protect spring flow or stream flow is very local based, and many of them don't have that right now. And I think that was one of the hopes that we had for a bill that Representative Larson filed that many of us were advocating for, which would have established an advisory board to really study those interactions, to look at what science was needed. And David, I keep saying everyone's last name because we have two Davids, but David Langford, you recently authored an op-ed where you talked about that bill. Can you tell us a little bit more about what motivated you to write that op-ed? It was in the Dallas Morning News just a few weeks ago, and I think maybe we can put a link to that in the chat as well, so everyone can take a look at it.
Yes, what motivated me to write that op-ed was what I've been motivated by most of my adult life here on our family's ranch. Our family's well, our household well of our part of our family's 7-generation ranch. My mother had that well drilled in 1960. From 1960, it was measured every year, the distance from the surface of the land to the surface of the water. That distance was measured every year until the year 2000. It stayed right about, water level stayed in that well right about 125 feet below the surface. From 2000, the year 2000 until today, it was measured today, it's 185 feet below the surface of the land. So there's 65 feet of the groundwater that's supposed to be our private property under this 7-generation ranch that has disappeared. Our use has not changed since 1877. So where has that water gone, and how strong are our property rights in that water? So I'm very much looking forward to some sort. I share the remorse that Representative Larson's bill did not pass, but because I feel like we need to get together, all of us, conservers and users, and try to figure out how we're going to stop that from happening, especially in the hill country where all the creeks and rivers and streams are all spring fed. And Dr. Mace is correct, the groundwater districts, I think they would very much want to help that process and help that process down at the courthouse, but they don't have the funding to do that. And the users of the water are they've got, it seems like infinite funding. So we need to all come together and figure out some way to keep what's happening from our well and others. No, we're not just not just our well. There's many other examples. Keep that from happening. That's why I wrote that op-ed.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying, and Ted and other landowners who I've engaged with, is that despite owning your groundwater, you don't really have a way right now to protect it, and that essentially the system is failing you because it's overly focused on the development of groundwater resources versus the conservation of it. And of course, that's going to have impacts to surface water resources that are connected to groundwater. David Yates, the Texas Wildlife Association, I know we're big proponents of private ownership of groundwater. And so I'm just curious, do you think that this current framework is working for all landowners? How could we improve upon it? Are the benefits of conservation and the rights of landowners like David Langford being given due weight in our current framework that we have right now?
That's a good question. Landowners are not a monolith, and they all have there are many different motivations. So, the question of, is this working for all landowners? Not all, some certainly. I'll remind you, the people that are producing water, they own that water too, right? And we always have this tension in natural resource work here in Texas, with being a private land state, being the culturally who we are, the private property rights that are so sacrosanct and protected in law. But there's always a tension with the natural resource and with conservation and commerce, and there's just all these strings pulling at all times. In my mind, I think the concept of ecosystem services of a market is one that would be a universal tool. There are better minds than mine on how to approach or arrive at a structure like that. But if a landowner has no incentive other than an altruistic one to conserve water, if they're still going to suffer a drawdown by their neighbors, so that neighbor is at some point impinging on landowner one's property right. But if the landowner one does not produce the water or use it, then it's going to drain off, so to speak. And I know that's wildly oversimplified, but there's got to be an incentive for that, for the conservation of that land, or compensation to that landowner for the taking of their property right. And the only way to arrive at that is with better and sharper and more sound science. And I hope the legislature will continue to entertain that and push towards it and fund it and encourage sound science to build a system like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a market is certainly one answer, and part of having a market, I think, is regulations in place to ensure that there's some that there's protections for everybody who would be participating in the market. And so that's where our groundwater districts come in for sure. And Vanessa, as the general manager of a groundwater district, I mean, how do you see your role in balancing what is this shared yet privately owned resource? I mean, how do you do it? It seems like a very difficult responsibility.
It is, and I think we've spent maybe the last 20 plus years in the groundwater world trying to figure that out. But at Barton Springs, we certainly may not have it all figured out, but we do believe that we're able to effectively create that balance by applying our statutory authority in a way that's kind of rooted in science and in partnerships and in stakeholder input. And in particular, our management framework is really strengthened by three main elements. I would say the first is the fact that we've established an adaptive regulatory framework. The second is really incorporating principles of sustainability and resilience into that framework. And then the third, which we've heard a lot today, is really investing in the science from which we can build like an equitable, customized policies for our aquifer systems. And so just to kind of expand a little bit about that, we've found that our regulatory program really must be adaptable and able to evolve as the science of the aquifers evolved, and as well as the laws governing the GCDs evolve. Through our regulatory framework, we feel that we at least aim to protect all landowners' private property rights on groundwater by managing the entire aquifer system sustainably for all uses and beneficial purposes. And in doing so, we establish a management regulatory framework that's really founded on science and vetted through the stakeholder processes. The evolution of our policies and strategies has really produced like a regulatory program that we feel is fair and innovative. And like I said, it needs to be customized district by district to the challenges that each district faces and that's unique to them. But really, when we move on to the conversation about sustainability and resilience, we feel like our framework was really designed with that in mind, such that we manage our resources for the next drought of record. And so to do that, we've, over the 30 years that we've been in existence, we've integrated management strategies like conditional permits and drought limits and management zones. We tried to make sure our DFCs, we aim for the DFCs to be more rooted in sustainability policies. And then really, we invest a lot into our data-driven evaluations to characterize these aquifers, including the surface water connections that are relevant to them. And so we focus a lot on informing our sustainable yield studies for our aquifer systems. And right now we're really knee deep in trying to figure out our Trinity Aquifer sustainable yield study. But that's really the model that we followed, is really investing in the data, in the science, and then vetting our policies through the stakeholder input. I would also say that, which I probably mentioned already, is that for a groundwater district to rely on sound science, it just requires an ongoing investment in the tools. And so it comes down to probably working with partners in a localized level, like you mentioned earlier, because while there are some tools that come down from the state agencies, we need kind of a combination of those regional tools and models along with localized tools and models to really make the best decisions. So those are the kind of the three main areas that I would say help us keep a balance.
No, y'all are doing some really great work at Barton Springs, which is why, I was happy you were able to share your perspective with us. And Dr. Mates, do you agree with Vanessa on, kind of that local versus regional science, and, talk to us a bit about science's role in effective groundwater management, and where are the gaps in Texas, and what do we need to be looking at doing moving forward?
Well, I listening to some of the answers before, it reminds me of the infamous words in the Texas Supreme Court decision, and they actually quoted the Ohio Supreme Court, where it said that groundwater is so secret, occult, and concealed that any attempt to essentially manage it would be wrapped in hopeless uncertainty. And I'm sure I've certainly had moments like that, and there's certainly some folks who would agree with that. But even back in 1904, when the Texas Supreme Court put those words in their decision that established rule of capture in Texas, we knew enough about the science of groundwater that if that science had been part of the discussion, that legal opinion, things could have been different in terms of knowing that pumping a well here does impact or tends to impact a well nearby. And so science is critical, and I would agree with what Vanessa was saying. Science helps us understand what it is that we know, what we don't know, how well we know what we know, and then we know better with time, and that all informs management. I talked about how well we know something that we know. In science, particularly hydrogeologic science, there is still uncertainty around these systems. It's not like a river that you can kind of measure over and over, see the water and see exactly the connectivity. And groundwater systems, I would argue, are much more complicated, and you have clues that you get from monitoring wells or wells that you've tested, particularly in Central Texas, where you have the Balcones fault zone and a lot of complexity. And so it's important for that science to, I think, be involved in a stakeholder process, like Vanessa noted, in transparency, rather than the science being generated in a dark back room. Getting feedback from stakeholders, perhaps even insights, and then building kind of trust and an understanding of the data, and then also have an adaptive management component, which means that you can change your decisions with time based on the information that you have. And so if the science gets better or reveals something that you didn't know before, you can then, as a district or management entity, change how you're managing, or maybe change your desired future condition in response to this new information.
Interesting. Yeah, I think there's so much more that we could be doing with science, and part of that too is just investing in more, because I know that I think every session, and Robert, you might know more about the exact amounts, like how much is actually allocated towards the groundwater models that the Water Development Board provides districts, but there is no funding really for the local refined modeling that districts need. Robert, Vanessa, and I have been involved in raising funds for several years for a model like that in the Blanco River watershed. And my hope is moving forward that EDF will become more engaged during the legislative session to really work and advocate for more funding for those types of refined models. And so I want to talk a little bit with y'all about your thoughts on what is next. The subject of this webinar, when we're looking ahead, we have an interim coming up. I know there's going to potentially be some special sessions. And then of course, the next session will be here before we know it, whether we want it here or not. What can we be doing, working on right now with agencies, with other nonprofits, this interim, to really move the ball on, let's say, groundwater surface water interaction data or science, or some of the potential protections for landowners like David Langford, incentives for them to be able to protect that groundwater in place. Love to talk a little bit about your thoughts on that. And maybe we could start with David Yates.
I think I'll definitely defer to expertise on what the right solution is in technical policy. But whatever it is, it needs to be done in a very inclusive and open and honest and organized way. You can't have too many cooks in the kitchen, but you also can't be just a lone ranger on any policy, substantive policy discussion. I'll share, in the long Iliad of eminent domain reform work at the Texas Capitol, we've been working with a single pair of bill authors on a single bill for 3 sessions. And that had landowner groups, that had principal industry groups, and then a lot of ancillary and other interested parties around that discussion. And it took us 3 sessions. It took us 6 years to get that bill across the finish line. And that's with industry saying, we want a bill too. We want this to get done. So back to the complications of the legislature that I referenced early, we've got to have some consensus. And I think the concept around the bill that was filed this session of enhancing science and digging in deeper, funding, better funding that, and really trying to understand the complexities is something that everybody can get behind. And, I guess I want to suggest maybe looking to folks that have figured out a pretty good solution. Vanessa Escobar, you guys are doing a great job. There are other examples like that, but there's also some shortcoming around the state as well, right? It's not this, monochromatic kind of thing. There's good actors or good executors and poor executors, and finding those examples of positive outcome and focusing on that as a template seems to make good sense to me.
David Langford.
Yes, it seems to me that it's really more. It's even more elementary than that. No matter how good. Well, David Yates is correct. Vanessa Escobar is correct. Dr. Mace is correct. All of those are all absolutely right in line. But still, you have, and even if the educational efforts are successful, even if all of the science is terrific, there are deep pockets that want to use that water. They don't care, and they're going to drag everybody down to the courthouse. In front of that courthouse, in front of every courthouse in America, there's a statue of a lady with a blindfold on, and she's holding 2 scales, and the scales are out of balance right now. They are in favor of those who want to use the water, irrespective of how good the science or the laws are. And those that want to conserve water and protect those resources cannot afford the fight. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to do that, as well as getting all the good science and the good bills in the legislature. The groundwater districts in particular are going to have to defend those decisions that they make, even though they have the best science and an educated population that they're dealing with. They're still going to have to go down to the courthouse, and they're still going to have to pay for those efforts. So we have to figure that into the equation somewhere also.
Yeah, that's the issue. I mean, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head, David, with that comment. And Vanessa, I mean, you just shared with us everything that your district is doing right now in terms of trying to find, balanced management, being very proactive in how you're approaching things. How, moving forward, do you think that you have set up a system that is going to protect y'all from lawsuits? I mean, are you concerned about that in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, there's no denying that, particularly where we are located, because the development is so rapid, the demand on our local resources is that much more. And so we see this demand just coming at us at a really fast rate. And so at the same time, we're really trying to kind of develop our science so that we can have some science-based rationale for how we decide to permit or set policies. But I would much rather see a groundwater district divert its resources to science than to litigation. But the reality is I do see more litigation coming and facing the groundwater district world in the near future. And that just has a lot to do with the development going on around the state. But I do think there are things that we can do at a state and local level and in advance of the next session. I would say, like, from the citizen landowner standpoint, I think it's really important for you to get to know your groundwater district board members and your county commissioners and city council members so that you can start fostering those conversations and those relationships on an ongoing basis. let them know what's important to you. You know, I also think that the groundwater districts can also continue to support continued engagement with the community and the landowners and the stakeholders. And from our perspective, it's really important for us to form those partnerships with universities and water institutes, as well as with the water user groups. For example, we have a lot of, you know, like rock quarries and ag use and public water supply use all throughout the Hill Country. And it's important to visit with those user groups to explore opportunities for how we can manage this shared resource. And really to maybe even go further and explore how we can cooperatively look at maybe cost sharing, feasibility studies, and pilot projects. I would also add that, like, in advance of the next session, I think we can't really underscore enough how important it is to keep the conversation and the education going, like David mentioned. And I think particularly we want to continue to educate our elected officials early, and all elected officials at all levels. And I think that there's a lot of value in the landowner groups really being vocal and being present, because, you know, there's one side of the landowner group that already is vocal and present, but they haven't heard enough probably from the other side of the landowner groups. And so I think it's also important for us to entertain the idea of meeting and engaging with the other side. It doesn't have to be, you know, water marketers versus landowners, because in the end, they're all landowners with the same rights. But I think the more you can get to the table and get both sides to the table, maybe we can start identifying where there is room for compromise and where there is common ground and buy-in, and maybe small pieces of progress can be kind of implemented. And so I think we need some more conveners to bring people together for those conversations. And then I would also like to see us explore working with our state agencies and our representatives at the legislature to maybe build like cost sharing grant programs, to where if our localized partners are willing to kind of invest in science, then maybe there's some opportunity for the state to match grants so that we can build models and tools together. That would go a long way to help us better understand our aquifers and adapt our management policies.
Those are some really, really great points. I, wondered maybe we should have explained early on just kind of how, for those on a webinar who may not really understand, that Texas's way of managing groundwater is local. And that is a benefit, I think, to landowners, because it allows landowners to have a voice in the process. And so your point, Vanessa, about really engaging with your local groundwater conservation district and engaging on this desired future condition process, which is not a very intuitive process. That is something that EDF and I hope to work on with Ted and the Headwaters Alliance over the next few years, is really looking at where landowners can start to participate more in that process, because I don't think that many landowners are doing that right now, and that is an important avenue. I do want to hear, Robert, I'm sure you have some wise words for things that we could be working on this interim. So please take a few minutes.
Sure. I'm going to take off my scientist hat and put on my policy analyst hat. As you mentioned, there's a local control of groundwater, and so that's resulted in 100 some groundwater conservation districts. And there's pros and cons that people argue about that. But one pro is that it's a marketplace of ideas. And so districts are trying different things. And one that's I think is interesting is the Guadalupe County Groundwater Conservation District. What I'm finding is, like, a lot of districts at the urban-rural interface, but when they were purely rural, their permitting scheme worked just fine. If the little town needed another permit, or Farmer Jane needed a permit. But once the big pumpers arrive, then the system appears to break down. Guadalupe County got ahead of that by implementing a geologically informed correlative rights permitting process. And so they've, and a correlative right means your volume of water, groundwater that you can produce is tied to your surface acreage. And there it also builds in a sand thickness. And that's a way of kind of working within the current statute, current law to actually achieve a desired future condition that they've set for themselves versus being forced, as is happening, I think, in other districts, to always raise the amount that can be pumped, and then you get the ancillary impacts on springs and surface water groundwater interaction. So I think looking at that as a potential method for districts to manage will be I think important to see if that can also be applied in other situations and geologic settings.
Okay, thank you. So I'm getting some questions coming through, and Ted, since you're going to close us out, I wonder if maybe you could leave us with your thoughts on the future moving forward, and I'll go ahead and skip to a few questions right now so we can make sure we have time to cover that. So this one is, I think, going to be kind of a doozy, but that's why I picked it. And it's really asking about the differences between groundwater management and oil and gas regulation. The question says, oil and gas in Texas recognizes reservoir connectivity and the protection of landowner mineral rights. Why is this approach not applied to groundwater? That could prevent certain owners from overproducing and impacting neighboring landowners. So who would like to take a stab at that one? I would say that there already are, a lot of similarities in groundwater law and oil and gas law that have helped, I think, inform the management of groundwater. But I get concerned because with oil and gas, the driver is development of it. There isn't really a reason to leave it underground, whereas we all recognize that there is a reason to leave some groundwater beneath the surface, as because it needs to be conserved in the long run and potentially is sustaining surface water resources. So anybody else want to jump in on that?
It also, and this is legal space, but my boss always warned me, Robert, don't pretend to be an attorney. But,
no, you're pretty good at doing that.
I never listened to him anyways, but another reason for conserving groundwater in place is to protect a groundwater right in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
Rule of capture still applies in Texas for groundwater. And so I think some argue that, and you own all the water in place. The Texas Supreme Court said that, but the rule of capture still applies. So your neighbor can still suck it out from underneath your property legally. There was words like fair share used in the Texas Supreme Court in a recent case, which is borrowed from the oil and gas patch. But I think there's, at least attorneys I talked to, there's room for interpretation, and so the correlative rights approach I discussed earlier gives everybody access to the resource. There is mining of the groundwater. It's not sustainable in Guadalupe County. And so there still is some mining going on, but there's also a cap on how much can be produced, and that becomes marketable, as well as allowing landowners to conserve, water in their district.
So if anybody else wants to jump in, but I have another question that relates to your point there, Robert, about caps and managing sustainably. So it says, the question is, can GCDs and advocates develop a long-range plan for sustainable yield, even laying out where production wells can be located? They can entertain bids for marketers to implement the plan rather than having to approve permits that may or may not be sustainable. So I think that the question is getting at, I think inherent to managing something sustainably is having a cap, set at that level. And also, you kind of need a cap in order to have a successful market. So I don't know who would like to jump in on that one. The question, can we develop a long-range plan for sustainable yield? Maybe Vanessa, since you're working on that in your district.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible, and I think that's what GCDs should do, is to strive to understand the aquifers and strive to understand where the differences may be within your jurisdiction. I think that it can come down to some policy decisions like establishing management zones or incentivizing, production on one side of the aquifer system where you're less likely to see impacts to the overall aquifer or to other groundwater users, and away from the areas that are sensitive, like, for example, on some of the aquifer outcrops where there's connection to the surface water components. So I think that is possible. It's helpful to have like robust tools to rely on when you're kind of making those evaluations, like numerical models, to understand the connections between the surface waters and the springs and groundwater. It's also important to have some kind of like stakeholder policy to where you are working with the decision makers to decide, what do we feel is sustainable in this area of the state, in this groundwater district in particular, and in this management zone in particular. So I think it's possible, and I would like to see groundwater districts do more of that. It's something we're taking a lot of time to look into for ourselves with our Trinity Aquifer Sustainable Yield. And I think there was maybe part 2 to that question about using that to, I guess, formulate a market within parts of your zones. I think the water market's a little more complicated, for us. I know down in EAA it works. They've established a cap. We would effectively have to have a cap to kind of create that. It's probably possible. I think that might be a future innovative strategy, but it may not work for all districts either.
Okay, well, we have gotten a lot of great questions and obviously don't have time to respond to all of them on the webinar, but I will be emailing everybody back who has asked a question because they're good ones. So we just have another minute or so left. And Ted, I want to turn it back over to you to give your parting thoughts and outlook and plan for the future.
Well, thank you all for participating, and Vanessa, thank you for organizing it. God, it went so beautifully, and I thought this panel that you put together is, stellar. And it was, it's a long game. This is not something, obviously, in listening to everyone, that we can solve overnight at all, and we can't afford to disregard, as David Yates was saying, people who may have a different opinion about where we're going. But I think we're going to have to touch on education, and we're going to have to touch on science, and we're going to have to work on interim solutions with groundwater districts. And there's just a host of things that you have all discussed that we need to be doing, short-term, long-term. But I think I see the future is in a groundswell of support for the notion and the importance of rivers and springs in Texas, and that Texas just isn't going to be Texas without its rivers, and the Hill Country in particular certainly will not be the Hill Country without its rivers and springs. And I think so as we work on a variety of bills, as we move forward in the next couple of years, I think we always have to keep our sights on the fact that there'll be a key bill that will accomplish a few key things. But in the end, we're basically building a larger constituency every time we're running into these challenges that we see. And so I think these difficulties that we run into are opportunities for us to build our tent and build our coalition and ultimately have a groundswell of support for Texas rivers. So anyway, this is great. This is, I'm sure, only the beginning, Vanessa, of you putting together those things. And
Yeah, I hope to have a lot more conversations with everybody.
we will. And for those who tuned in, let's stay tuned in and send us your information. This was recorded, so you can share this thoughtful discussion with others. And I look forward to having many others with all of you. So thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.